with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Miyuki.
Great. Thanks so much, and it's really a pleasure to get the chance to speak with all of you today. I'm really excited not only to share what my co-authors and I have worked on, but also to hear from all of you, because we're looking at all of this from afar, but it's really all of you who are in the trenches making these decisions day to day. So I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback and discussing this issue a little bit more in depth. There we go. Okay, so just a quick look at what's coming. I'll start with a little bit of motivation and how I think our piece of research fits into the broader challenges around climate change adaptation that we're facing. I'll then walk through the actual study, which basically tried to answer this question, looking back at past experience. What do we know about the way managed retreat has been applied so far? And then finally, what does this tell us about the future? What are ways that we can harness these lessons learned and maybe make managed retreat work for us a little bit more going forward? So as a starting point, the broad motivation for all of this is that our coasts are facing greater and greater climate risks as the climate changes. So this takes a bunch of different forms. Of course, we have gradual sea level rise that leads to nuisance flooding like we see on the left. And we've also got extreme events, and that's perhaps not a necessary reminder given the hurricane season that we've experienced so far. But we've always had hurricanes, and we've always had things like erosion threatening our coastal developments, and so we have already risk management measures to deal with those hazards. And these tend to fall in one of three categories that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So we can protect, we can build seawalls and levees, we can accommodate elevation, insurance, things that make the damage less bad when the water does encounter things that we care about. And finally, we can retreat, so we can just pick up and get out of the way of the hazard and reduce risk that way. The way that we think about this is that the risk management strategies we see emerge from some underlying system. And this is a very, very simple graphic, but essentially on the left, you've got your climate and your geophysical hazards. You have people and things that we care about. Those overlap and create risk. And then in the middle, you have decision-making processes, which is where the Coastal Commission fits in. That's also individuals and households making choices about where to live, how much to offer for a house, and all the way up to national and international governance systems that affect how we process the risk and make decisions about what to do about it. But if you look forward, basically, all of these components are going to change. So we're going to have different hazards. We're also going to have changes in land use and population that's going to affect the risk that we see on coasts. Our laws, our policies might change, our values might change, and then we're going to see some change in the portfolio of measures we're using to manage these risks. So what motivates our work is this question. How are these portfolios going to change? And more importantly, what levers do we have to shape the portfolios into ones that best meet our societal goals? And of course, there's hundreds, thousands, many careers worth of research questions in there, but we chose to focus on that little gray wedge of retreat. And retreat is probably, or almost definitely, the strategy that we have the least experience with so far, both in the US, but also globally. But things are changing. I think the realities of climate change, looking forward at sea level rise, which is only going in one direction, has pushed us to contemplate these types of questions a little bit more. Are there places where we would all be better off if we didn't live there? And if so, what do we do about it? So what my co-authors, Chris Field and Catherine Mock, and I decided to do was to really take a bird's eye view of managed retreat. What's been done so far, and how can we extract generalizable lessons from what's been done so far to guide some of these discussions and decisions that we're facing around retreat. So just to be clear, this is very much a bird's eye view. We didn't go deep into the weeds of any individual instance of managed retreat, and we're really looking for cross-country, cross-situational lessons that we can learn rather than identifying the individual factors that shaped any one case. So our research basically breaks down into 3 steps. First, we had to actually set out what we are looking for, define what we are going to include as managed retreat. Then we went out and looked through a bunch of different sources to see what we could find, and we found 27 different cases of managed retreat, and I'll describe what those are. And then we really did the meat of the analysis, which was comparing these cases and trying to identify, what makes them similar, what makes them different, were there barriers that we saw across all of them, and what made them work, if they did work. So step 1, we defined managed retreat as the strategic relocation of structures or abandonment of land to reduce natural hazard risk. So that includes what we call strategic relocation, meaning there has to be some type of coordinating involved. If I just pick up and move because the risk is too high, we didn't count that, in part because it's really hard for us as researchers to observe that, but also because when we talk about levers that we have to shape retreat, we're really talking about coordinated, somehow managed efforts to do this. We also included cases where a managed retreat was initiated but not completed for a variety of reasons. We did not include resettlement or relocation for any other primary reason. So dam construction, for instance, broader development goals. Plenty of relocation has been done for those purposes, but that's not in our sample. We exclude autonomous migration, as I mentioned, and just for the purpose of this study, we didn't consider when only assets were moved. So lighthouses in national parks being lifted up and moved landward, we didn't consider those here, though those are certainly examples of managed retreat. All of our cases involve humans pretty directly. So we looked through news articles, research papers, nonprofit reports, and we ended up finding 27 cases over the past 3 decades or so that have moved, we think, about 1.3 million people. As you can see, pretty much every major world region is represented here, and we included all natural hazards. So this is everything from riverine flooding to earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, any natural hazard you can think of, basically. And each case is often, many of the cases are collections of interventions. So I'll talk through a couple of the cases here to give you a sense of what we're talking about before I move on to describing the comparative analysis. So in the US, we basically see 2 types of managed retreat. On the left-hand side, you have grassroots, community-driven relocation efforts. This is a photo from Alaska. There are 3 villages there that you probably have heard of in the news. They have voted each collectively to move and have been trying for many years now to get the funding to do so. There's another example in southern Louisiana where that community recently got funding to move, and that's underway. The other example that we see in the US are FEMA buyout programs through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And essentially what happens through this program is that federal funds are used by local and state agencies to offer homeowners their pre-disaster market value for their house. If the homeowner chooses to accept, then the property is restored to open space and permanently. This is actually quite widespread. We think about 100,000 people have moved in the US through these buyout programs, including this example here, which is in Staten Island. I'll talk briefly about 2 non-US examples. So in the Netherlands, they had a Room for the River program, which did exactly what you think it might from the title. Essentially, they were looking for ways to reduce their flood risk without simply building higher levees, and they already have a very extensive levee system. So one thing they did was in the village of de Noordwerd. They actually lowered the levees around de Noordwerd to allow it to flood more frequently, thereby protecting towns downstream and giving them a much higher level of flood protection without simply building higher levees around it. This entailed the government basically going house to house for the 75 households that lived in de Noordwerd. Most of them were bought out, and a few of them decided to stay, and their houses were moved onto these elevated mounds like you see here. And that area now floods, I think, a few times a year. And I don't believe it's happened yet that the waters have gotten so high that these people have to evacuate, but there is a whole plan in place in case that occurs. Another example from the UK is the Coastal Change Pathfinder pilot program. So this was an experimental program that the UK government did by giving about 5 local councils funding to somehow address properties and public assets at high risk from erosion. So one example, and I imagine these pictures look pretty familiar to people working in California, but this is the town of Haysboro in 1996 and 2012, and you can see the properties on the lower half there. Largely, the structures have disappeared. In the UK, they actually have a legal provision saying they cannot compensate homeowners whose houses are lost to coastal erosion. So they had to find a lot of different ways to support homeowners in getting them to move away from the coast. And a lot of them ran into obstacles. Most of them managed to move most, but not all of the properties that they were hoping to move. So now that you have some sense for what we're talking about, basically we took each of those cases and organized them on a number of different dimensions. And so these are some of the dimensions we looked at. Was the relocation right after a disaster, or was it not? Was it in response to a hazard like erosion, which is slow moving, or a tsunami, which is a sudden onset, really dramatic event? And through a number of these different factors, we ended up emerging with some clusters of cases. So the first and largest set of cases we saw were mandatory resettlement cases. These are almost entirely in developing countries right after major disasters. So for instance, in Indonesia and Sri Lanka after the tsunami in 2004, national governments imposed setback zones from the coast, and whoever used to live within 100, 250 meters of the coast had to be resettled as a result. Those cases make up the overwhelming number of the people that we have seen relocated so far. We also saw a couple of other examples that were similar to the FEMA buyout program. They were actually some community-scale voluntary relocation programs done in Japan after the tsunami and in Australia after a flash flood. The next set of cases are these isolated settlement cases, which include the Alaska and the Louisiana villages that I mentioned earlier. There are very similar stories taking place in Panama and in the Pacific Islands. The managed realignment set of interventions are in the UK and Germany, where in each country, in I think probably dozens of locations now, they've purposefully breached coastal defenses in order to shift the coastal line landward and reduce the amount of spending on coastal defenses. Those actually have largely not forced people to move, though they have had to compensate landowners for land lost in the landward shift. And finally, we have these two examples that I mentioned earlier that don't really fit neatly into any of those clusters. So once we had these clusters, we stopped for a second and said, why do these seem different from one another? What makes them similar? And we think that two things really matter. The first thing that we think really matters is who initiated the process. And so clearly, with voluntary relocation with these Alaskan villages, it's being driven by the residents. And in the two examples I mentioned earlier, in the Netherlands and in the UK, the process is starting with the government agency motivating the move. we think this matters, of course, because it captures how the residents feel about the process. Do they want this to happen or do they not want this to happen? And we find that residents often favor retreat for a variety of different reasons. So partially it is out of just concern for the households, financially and health and safety-wise. But we also see a number of narratives where homeowners really feel like they're doing a social good by moving, that this land should be in its natural state. It's not meant for people to live in, and they wouldn't have sold for a redeveloper, but they will sell under the condition that this is restored to its natural state. So there are a lot of different reasons we see for why residents might favor this. I think another important component is that the narrative for residents can either be that it's a loss, they're moving away from something they cherish, or it can be they're moving to a better place. And so in survey-based studies, you see that younger people and people who are unemployed tend to have a lot more favorable views of relocation because they see opportunity in the move rather than simply a loss. And finally, this question of who starts the process is important because it affects how much the government agency has to do. In the Alaska relocation cases or in the buyouts, the government is really playing a facilitating role, but the Alaskan villages are the ones going out and trying to find the places to live, figuring out which agencies need to be involved at different stages. And on the other hand, in the Netherlands, when the government was driving the process, they were literally going door to door and negotiating one by one and helping people find places to move to. So it's a really different picture depending on who starts this process. The other thing we think really matters is who benefits from retreat. And so we typically think about retreat benefiting the people that move because they're going to a safer place, and that's true, but in some cases there's also a really clear other constituency that benefits from that move taking place. And so in the US, we'll only offer buyouts to properties where the benefit-cost ratio makes sense for us to do so. So clearly there's a concern for the taxpayers for that broader societal benefit that dictates whether we're going to do it or not. In the Room for the River case, the other group was even more clear. Right? It was the towns downstream that were going to be safer if this area upstream became a floodplain. And so we think this component really matters because it captures what the government agency is thinking when they're doing it. It's not perfect, so of course there are many other things that are going to affect the extent of implementing agency support, including political considerations, equity considerations. But you do see that in cases where there's clear benefits to everyone else, it's easier to get different levels of government involved and easier to, in some cases, change laws really quickly in order to make it happen. So you did see in Australia, for instance, there was really rapid zoning change to accommodate a relocation effort that they said, would have taken years. They did it in 3 weeks, and they were able to make the move happen that way. I will mention that this is a fuzzy concept, both to myself and I think to everyone else studying retreat, but it does seem to matter both for what the government agency is able to do and the way that the residents perceive what they're doing. As I mentioned, when they know a lot of other people are benefiting, the frame for what they're doing is slightly different. It might not be surrender. It might be contributing to the public good. So when you put all this together, you get this conceptual model with all of our different cases laid out on this 2x2 matrix. And I think what's interesting about this is that the ones where we see incomplete efforts to move, where the relocation has been started, but not everyone targeted to move has moved, principally in the isolated settlements case, and then also partially with the Pathfinder and some of the mandatory resettlement efforts. So in the top right and largely the top left, you actually see the move occurring, whereas it seems to be much more of a struggle to actually get everyone on the same page and moving in the same direction in the lower half, and especially on the bottom right here. So looking forward, I think the first thing, and very, very important, is that none of this research says anything about what should happen or what a successful managed retreat looks like. Perspectives will differ for two different households going through the same intervention, even two different people in the same household going through the same intervention. And so I certainly don't want this to be taken as some kind of guide for when to do it and when not to do it, because that's not the purpose of the research. In the US in particular, we often see misaligned incentives. You know, if you ask any mayor in America, they probably will say that every inch of their town is worth protecting. And so the scale of decision-making really matters. When higher levels of government are involved, it seems like, given that they bear more of the disaster risk, it's more likely that retreat is favored. That's a problem, I think, largely in the US because of the nature of local property taxes and the reliance of local governments on those taxes. We don't see that nearly as much in other countries. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, so I think in the US we really think about buyouts a lot. I know I thought about buyouts a lot when I started studying retreat, and then it was interesting to see that even in very similar developed countries, they are going much farther than simply handing the homeowners a check for their property. They're helping them find new places. They're allocating new areas for development to accommodate the people moving. And I think that flexibility is a piece of the puzzle that we haven't gotten into in the US yet, though we're starting to with the Louisiana relocation. Another thing is, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just where you're leaving, it's where you're going to that really matters. And so creating a pull, not just a push, is, I think, another piece that we haven't really thought about that much here. In particular, aligning other public investment to the locations that we think we want to make attractive locations for people to live, I think is a very important piece. And, you know, people do, at least in the real estate literature, people do look at the sort of the seeming, like the interest of the government in investing in that neighborhood when they think about where to live. And so when we think about signaling, the pull is, I think, just as important as the push. And then finally, if you think about that 2x2 matrix, it's not clear where future communities are going to land on that spectrum. We don't really know how people feel about retreat. We assume they don't want it, but we don't really know. And I think there's a component of monitoring and just keeping track of course, where are the physical risks? You know, how many more years, how many more decades, given the erosion rate, do we have? But also just keeping track of the attitudes. Are there places where households feel like they would have a lot to benefit by moving? And are there places where the incentives do make sense for both parties to make this happen? I think, of course, we're always scared of imposing, and rightfully so. I think people should be in control of where they live, but there are opportunities to help people and to allow them a fresh start that might be going unnoticed because we're not actually exploring attitudes towards retreat in a lot of these communities. And that's